Concerning baggage, not luggage, baggage. Baggage is what modern minds have been trained to call all experiences, knowledge, which hinders communal peace and avoids conflict. It is a way of rendering the mind stupid before the need to belong and to be docile and tolerant towards the other. It is a way of shaming certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of experiences so as to make them forgettable, as if they never happened. This is dumbing down. The only conflict allowed at this stage is the indirect, passive-aggressive, feminine kind. They will associate it with all experiences which burden the mind so that it cannot function normally, quote unquote. But this is a description of all emotions, experiences, knowledge, which controls the mind and overwhelms its judgments and restricts its activities. All, including love, compassion, tolerance, dependence, and all those things they would consider positive. The selective usage of the shaming term baggage is meant to dissuade certain kinds of memories, excluding them from consideration, and not allowing them to enter the ongoing interactions and what judgments that may come of them. To simply declare life a product of overabundance, superfluity, is to totally ignore the very experience of living. Nothing in nature or in any living experience hints at abundance. If anything, nature is characterized, outside human constructs and human interventions, by distinct austerity. Human environments tend to correct this austerity. We might say that the emergence of human environments is in reaction to the severity man evolved within. To even entertain the delusion of overflowing overabundance, one would have to simply ignore one's own senses and sensations, one's own common sense, if you will, allowing himself to submit to the dictates of emotionalism, and then make a mockery of himself and of his own life. If this is what enlightenment entails, then I will have no part in it. If I am to die as some decrepit boil on the arse of a god, then let me do this with whatever dignity remains for me to claim and to preserve. Let me die as what I am, a man. Pleasure. Pleasure is a momentary experience of excess. In that moment of release from need, from the sensation of lack, the mind feels liberated from its role and from the experience of existing. For a short time it experiences an excess of energies, as the ones dedicated to the satisfaction of the particular one have reached an end, a culmination, and what remains fills it with a sense of profound empowerment. From this short burst, all metaphors and projections of excess and of perfection and of the positive absolute derive their inspiration. Suddenly, discrimination ceases to be a sign of a refined mind and is turned into a vice, the postmodern latch-on to eliminate all multiplicity and finally surrender to the presumed unity their minds have been redirected towards. The very mechanism of distinguishing the edible from the poisonous, the ally from the foe, the dangerous from the harmless, is now diminished, as nothing can stand in the way of total inclusion and complete uniformity. Thoughtlessness is promoted as the only way out of suffering, as without the necessity to distinguish, there is nothing left to think, as thinking itself has no purpose other than the one given to it by the idealist who sells existence as a mustering point before nirvana. Even stupidity can be liberation, when what is perceived more clearly with a discriminating eye cannot be dealt with, and so it must be dismissed. The tragedy of awareness is that it exposes the organism to the absence. Those who survive this preliminary step without fleeing from it, and without being driven to madness by it, are set on the road towards nobility. How far they will advance will be decided by their constitution. Along the way one finds humor in the quandary. There is a difference between the bottom-up and the top-down modes of thinking. The former takes the observed, the known, the perceived, analyzes it, seeking patterns of repetitive predictability, or combining it into newer possibilities to extrapolate and deduce the unknown. The latter begins with the known, which must remain by the fact that it is unknown, unsubstantiated, and contrary to experience and sensual awareness. It then figures out ways to justify its logic. The first method is burdened with uncertainty and the anxieties this produces, whereas the second method alleviates anxiety by pretending to know, only feeling stressed by the need to define and explain this knowledge, so as to retain its effect. The mind is attracted to what is most familiar to it, to what is similar. What is different is what distinguishes this other from the mind observing, but also from all otherness. The perception of what is similar depends on simplification, generalization to establish a commonality based on partial awareness, a looking from afar where all details blend into one and become indistinguishable in detail. The closer the observer comes to the observed, to what appears familiar at a distance, the more it becomes aware of differentiations. At a sufficient distance, even a gorilla looks human. Consciousness, therefore, is dependent on perceiving a differentiation within the familiar. The more unconscious a mind is, the duller its acuity is, or the more unaware of distinctions it becomes. Details get blurred into a haze of uniformity. For it, the world is mostly unvarying, with slight departures that are easily ignored or blend into new shades of the same. A blue-gray dot within a sea of blue becomes another shade of the same. Such a mind lacks the discriminating perception to distinguish within what seems familiar the details, which would make them more particular, richer, more refined. To an insensitive nose, for example, all fragrances smell about the same and are labeled under the common heading of perfume. But a more sophisticated nose can pick up details and discriminate and categorize with more precision and more taste. For such a nose, not all fragrances are created equal or deserve the same appreciation. To claim that they do so is to do injustice to the techniques used to manufacture them, and to the virtuosos who can find in them what the common man cannot even imagine. In modern social systems, the promotion of non-discrimination and tolerance for the base amounts to a dulling of acuity, resulting in a more uniform group behavior, founded on more uniform perceptions. It drops everything to the common perception of mediocrity and renders this subtle, invisible to all but a very few. At this point, we can no longer speak of a singular human species. At this point, the differences, no matter how small, are so decisive that no amount of general similarity can make them go away. I can no more be similar to another, even if this other is my twin or my clone, than I can be to my own self. I am not the same person a moment ago as I will be a moment from now. A divergence, no matter how slight, has made me other than, and my consciousness lags behind the flow of time, playing eternal catch-up. What keeps me intact are my memories, genetic or experiential, and so memory, down to the most trivial detail, is the foundation of self-consciousness. Extrovert. A psychological disposition seeking self in otherness. It can be thought of as being representative of a more primitive sense of self, where, like animals, the fulfillment of need is governed by outwardly focused senses. In such cases, the identity sought by the mind is but a reflection of public opinion, popular decree being a dominating factor. For this reason, such minds want to impress others, so as to gain that positive feedback that enlarges their self-esteem. Introvert, a psychological disposition seeking self inwardly through introspection or self-knowledge. It is a product of an emerging self-consciousness, which is consciousness turned inward, or experiencing self from the vantage point of a detached bystander. Sometimes it can be the consequence of a reaction to external phenomena which threaten the mind, forcing it to hide in its own imagination. An extreme of this might be considered solipsism, the denouncement of the world as being the total product of self. Introspection, sometimes taken on the method of meditation, is a form of looking at the past, the sum of which is what identity truly is. The study of self in the immediate becomes an analysis of the manifestations of this past, a deciphering of the physical, so as to determine and understand the past, and so to understand one's own self. Such a mind usually become more discriminating, as self-knowledge imposes a more clear concept of similarity and distinction. A communal schizophrenia characterizes civilization. Man grows aware of himself and thinks another is watching him or watching over him. He acts and he thinks as if he were but the instrument of anotherness. He talks to himself in his solitude and believes it to be the voices of spirits or gods, if he is arrogant enough. The mind's self-controlling agencies have the potential to drive a man insane. Hedonist. Hedonist is the captive who attempts to escape through surrender. In the momentary intoxication of lovemaking, the participants lose themselves and feel this befuddled condition as a relief and a transient sensation of an approach towards the desired unity, a final completion. This is where love acquires its mystical value, a secret death wish, shared but never admitted. The twofold expression of majesty. 1. To possess what others covet, and not be overly affected by their desire. 2. To lose what others covet, and not be overly affected by its loss. The first is the external manifestation of power. The second is its internal source, forever unavailable to all who covet. Schopenhauer said, "Happiness consists in frequent repetition of pleasure. The average person often misconstrues pleasure for happiness, or is convinced that they are synonymous. Hedonism is turned into evidence of a happy life, though it may be nothing more than an escape from the real. When personal judgment is usurped by the judgment of another, shame is felt, self-consciousness feeling vulnerable under the gaze of another. When the judgment of the other is usurped by personal judgment, pride is felt, self-consciousness either denying the validity of the judgment of another or having reached a level of self-awareness that exceeds that of the other, feeling secure under the gaze of the other. Both can be wellsprings of contentment and discontentment. Sadness. Sadness is the capitulation of the soul to horror. It weeps for its own faded future and unvindicated past. To pity oneself is to wish for the other's recognition of you as being a pitiful creature. It is a cry for help in a world that just doesn't care. Anger is not only natural, it is essential for survival. It prepares the organism to do battle when flight is not an option. Energies are gathered and directed towards the parts of the body which will be used in a fight, making any prolonged state of anger a health hazard. When adopting the feminine ideals, the sexual game of attractions turns into a competition over style and appearances to hide or accentuate one's real essence. Men used to attract females with their mind, their creativity, their access to resources, wealth, their social status, their genetic potential, athleticism, their character, and sense of humor. Now it has become a competition over fashion, skincare, hairstyles, popularity, emotional availability, sensitivity, and girlish sway. Of course, the process is incomplete, as everything is, and we are but in the midst of a trend I call feminization, but the first signs are becoming harder to ignore or to explain away. As it is to be expected, males will adapt to whatever is required to carry out their biological mission, to seed as many females as possible. Those who adapt first and more enthusiastically are the ones who find in their avant-garde ability to be on the forefront of fashion trends their biggest advantage over the more resistant, more masculine males. It is a classic beta male tactic. Taking care of oneself, quote unquote, is what they call it, but what it really is this obsession with appearing to be more than what one really is. In these sperm wars, the new intelligent weapon is pretense and social adaptability. The metrosexual is heterosexual, but in these times when feminine characteristics are more desirable, more valuable, they take on the look they need to be sexually attractive. The trick is to get the second glance. Homosexuality is a mutation dependent on parasitism to come about. Its innocuousness in regards to intergroup sexual hierarchies and its potential for producing effete males that pose no threat to the dominant male status makes this mutation socially advantageous, particularly within large social groups where large numbers of males are integrated into the shared hierarchy. One more variation of paraphilia, homosexuality, is no different than pedophilia, bestiality, necrophilia, and any other of the human sexual practices which are dysfunctional from an evolutionary standpoint, in that they fail to produce any offspring, but only gain purpose by playing secondary, more current social and cultural roles. Since it holds such an important, increasingly so, part in modernity, it deserves its own special validation, particularly when it has been removed from the list of sexual fetishes in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, along with its variant, bisexuality. Let's be clear. Homosexuality is no different than any other human sexual mutation, and if it deserves special mention, it is only because of its increasingly central role in modern social systems and within the psyches of the modern normal, so to speak, man. That it is no longer considered a mental disorder by the certified specialists gives hope to a variety of other sexual deviations that are still on the list as mental disorders. These things, after all, take time, and progress sometimes proceeds at a snail's pace. The logic, quote unquote, must be followed through, and if modern man wishes to still believe that he is egalitarian and open-minded, then the acceptance of bestiality, pedophilia, and many more sexual practices must be cleared from the annals of bigotry, or so it goes. Do they dare? Both the male and female versions of homosexual behavior, along with bisexual variants, are the byproducts of genetic mutations which come about and are reinforced by environmental conditions. The genetic predisposition to this mutation might be present in a bloodline without always emerging as a dominant factor. Although the environmental conditions that contribute to its emergence are not fully comprehended, what is certain is that some hormonal imbalances during the period of gestation contribute to its emergence. The triggering on and off of particular genes by environmental circumstances is now part of a scientific field called epigenetics.